and welcome back to Complexity Unpacked with Professor G. I'm really excited to bring you this episode. I have an opportunity to sit down with my old friend Keith Richards. Keith and I used to teach use of force together to local community college students, focusing on verbal de-escalation, officer safety tactics, and sort of helping them navigate the complexities, if you will, of life in law enforcement. But today we're sitting with Keith to unpack his 31-year career, and he's been gracious enough to give us his time. And so I welcome you, Keith, to my podcast and at the same time to my video channel. So thank you for being with me.
My pleasure.
So as a way of introduction, just so I let everybody know, Sergeant Keith Richards served as a police officer for 31 years with Durham Regional Police. And for my listeners that are not in Canada, that's a regional police service in Southern Ontario, just outside of Toronto. And he's recently begun the next chapter of his life, which is life in retirement. So he graduated from Ontario Police College back in 1990. And over the course of 31 years, worked in several units, including the Community Resource Unit and the Constable Recruiting Unit. Keith has always been an active member of his local community. He's been a volunteer wrestling and football coach at local high schools, and he's been on the board of directors for Pride Durham, as well as one of the founding members of Durham Pride Prom, which I'm sure Keith will tell us a little bit more about shortly. He was the first diversity coordinator for his service and the lead trainer for their fair and impartial policing program. So welcome, Keith. I'm happy to have you here on Complexity Unpacked, and I hope that you and I can positively contribute to the teaching and learning community.
Absolutely.
How is retirement treating you so far, my friend?
So it's been excellent. It's a bit of an adjustment. Spending 3 decades in a structured environment where most of the rules, regulations are laid out for you, to now you have to lay out your own rules and I guess essentially regulations to manage your life. So it's been a little different, but I'm loving it. I'm only a month in, so I don't have a lot of seniority on that front. It's been excellent. It's been a great journey, and so as I slowly prepare for my post police retirement chapter and open up my new chapter moving forward, it's been exciting.
Awesome. Well, now that you're on this end, I'm going to ask that we take you all the way back. And hopefully we can unpack in this conversation some of those 31 years and share the perspectives as you experienced them when you went through them. So why don't I start all the way back in the beginning? What were you doing before policing, and what brought you to policing?
Interesting. It's interesting. I'm going to go back further than you probably expected. So here's the thing. So I grew up in a household where police weren't. They were to be avoided, and that's kind of the way that my parents fashioned it. I wouldn't say that my parents were anti-police. They just said stay away from them because nothing positive can come from being involved in any type of police interaction. So that's how I, started my frame of reference around law enforcement at a very young age. So I'm going to say that adolescent, grade 5, 9-year-old kind of thing. And and I will go so far as I remember having a talk with my mother. She had a talk with me, and she would say, "When you see the police, you run." That was her, and I never forget. She probably said a whole whack of things, but my takeaway from that is, you see the police, you run. I remember that quote like she said it to me yesterday. That started framing my reference on how I should treat local law enforcement, right? Not that they're adversaries, but that I should avoid them at all costs. And then I had this interesting experience where there were 3 different officers in the local police division that would constantly just stop me and talk to me. And neither of the 3 knew the other 2 were doing this. For whatever reason, they took a shine to me. And they would literally stop me all the time. I would be on my bike, they stopped me all the time. Now, I'm sure to the person walking by, they thought I was being admonished or what have you, but they were just talking to me. And my nickname as a kid was Bubba, and they would say, where are you going, Bubba? What are you up to, Bubba? And they literally just stop on the side of the road and talk to me and then be on their way. And then that transferred from being a kid on his bike to a young man in his first car. And then they were pulling me over, and they would say, "Where you heading, Bubba?" And they'd be talking me on the side of the road. Looked like I'm getting pulled over. I've never received a ticket, but I'm sure to the person driving by, this kid's in trouble. They were literally just talking to me. And what they did is over that, I'm gonna say almost a decade, I developed a relationship with these officers, and a profound one actually, and so much so that I thought at some point I want to emulate them. So park that part. My parents then say to me, "Guess what? We're moving to Florida. We're going to the U.S. We're moving to Florida. You're welcome to come with us, or you're welcome to stay." You know, I had a scholarship for school, but in a Canadian scholarship, you can't live off that. So I knew I was going to have to go into the world of work because my parents were going. Now I could have went with them, but that wasn't my whole family, my whole existence was in Canada. So they left to go to Florida. I ended up working at Chrysler, building automotive, well, building cars really, for Chrysler, and lots of great money. They paid you very well when you're in automotive, but I hated the job. You were basically essentially a machine, and I knew I could not do this for the rest of my life. And I had a couple of friends that were already police officers, and I never forgot about the impact that those three officers had done to me. And I promised myself that I would follow up on that. Started studying for the requirements of being a police officer, started going through the testing. Takes about somewhere between 6 and 8 months to become an officer. And I went through all the testing, went through all the interviews, went through all all the things that are required for you to get employment with the police. And went through it, passed everything. Went down to the Ontario Police College in 1990, where I started that journey. But I can honestly say that the impact of those three officers is far-reaching. It didn't just impact me to make me want to be like them. It changed my parents, who were the ones that were advocating for me to avoid the police, into pro-police. I would go visit them in Florida, and they would have support the Tampa police, support the Sarasota police, support this, support that. I would walk into the house saying, "Where am I?" Right? And they became the biggest supporters of the police as a result of my experiences. And basically, they changed everybody in my family from looking at police as an entity to avoid, to being the biggest supporters of the police. All based on the investment that three officers did for a little 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 13-year-old, 16-year-old, decades before. And I always tout that message when I talk to new recruits, because you never know how much that seed investment will prosper into the tree outcomes. And so, and the biggest thing and the biggest takeaway for something like that is your job is to make the investment, but your job is not to reap the rewards, right? And people have to remember that, right? It's a very selfless experience. It's to say, I'm going to plant those seeds, that investment, but I am not going to reap the rewards. Somebody else down the road will reap the rewards of my investment, right?
Which is really the essence of a service orientation, right? And it's that's the funny thing is, that's what a lot of young people talk about when they first talk about wanting to get into police. They talk about service. They're wanting to serve their community. So I think that's an excellent example of it. You've touched already on several key points that I hope we will get to today. And one of them will be, this idea of interaction and public interaction with the police, and the lasting effect that can have, both positive and negative.
Yeah.
But let's get to that in a little bit. I'm going to put a pin in that one for now. Take us through. So it's 1990. You're newly hired, and you're off to police college, which is a standard procedure here in Canada. All our municipal services go to one college, right? And that's the Ontario Police College in Elmer, Ontario. Talk to us about that experience. Maybe you can contextualize that for any police officers listening outside of Canada.
Yeah. So the Ontario Police College, one of the largest police training facilities in North America. I believe in terms of size and intake, it's only bested by the Federal Bureau of Investigations because it houses the learning for the entire province. And so you have the Ontario Police College, you go there, it's in Elmer, Ontario, which is essentially Mennonite Amish country. So there are lots of horse and buggies. But the advantage of it being there is less distraction. Pretty much from any part of the campus, there's fields. So you're isolated, but at the same time, that's probably a good thing. And so it becomes this self-contained town or entity in itself, and it has everything that they need in order to prepare you for your next journey as being a police officer. You go there, you start learning things of structure, you start learning how to do the basic requirements of a constable. Now, they do have some challenges at the Ontario Police College because they are working on developing officers for the entire province. And so there are lots of nuances to that, because an officer in our northern part of our province may not need the same requirements as the southern part, right? So you have
and just sorry, just to contextualize that last comment, the vast majority of the Canadian population is actually reside within 250 kilometers of the American border.
Yes.
We are the largest landmass, but
Yes.
our population density is all concentrated along that long southern border, right? So just some perspective for some of the listeners.
Yeah. Right. And so what happens with that is you might be like the Windsor Police or Niagara, where you border right onto the US. So you have a lot of populace coming across the border that are American populace. And so you need to also learn the nuances of the American experience if you want to properly police that environment versus somebody that might be up in Timmins or Sault Ste. Marie, where they may have a higher Indigenous population. Right? And what does that look like? What's the context behind policing a large Indigenous population versus that? So there are all these things that the Ontario Police College has to consider when they're developing curriculum for their officers. You start going through, you learn how to tactically drive police vehicles, you learn how to do your basic powers of arrest, you start learning general law and that type of thing. Probably some things that you wouldn't expect to learn necessarily, which would be how to negotiate your way through a domestic situation. Right.
Well, I think I think that you're bringing up some valid points, and I think that's interesting because sometimes there's a preconceived notion that you need a policing or a justice education to get into policing. So that is not the case. The police will look at people from a wide spectrum of society, and they have a range of educational and life backgrounds. And so I think that those courses are really important for people coming out or coming into policing from other fields, and it's critical that we have that baseline level of knowledge. It's also advantageous for those of my students, for example, that come out of justice programs that have some awareness. But those are the technical details that they're focusing in on to get some uniformity, if you will, across the service. Talk to me a little bit about how you felt walking in. So I have a sense of what they do, but Keith Richards walks in the door. You're in a remote town. You've described this as a remote town. I'm familiar with it, but what's that like?
So it was so just driving there. My first experience in physically seeing horse and buggies on the side of the road. I still remember my first night there driving. I got there in the evening. It was already dark, and going around these candle lit buggies to get there. I will never forget seeing that. I walk into the police college and I think, I'm here, as though I'm at Mecca or something, and I'm like, I'm at Ontario Police College, right? And and you recognize that everybody from the entire province is here to get what you're getting, and you start looking back, thinking about that journey that got you there in the first place. You walk into the building, and you can immediately see, you don't necessarily see it, you can sense the structure in the building, if that even makes sense. Everybody's walking, but it's like people are walking with purpose, right? There's no window shopping, right? Somebody's going to A and B. They're going somewhere with purpose, and you can sense that in their structure and body language. And you get there, you get your room number, all this stuff, and you're in these pods. There's about 10 people per pod, and so you have a common area in the pod. And then you have your basic room, which is a bed, a desk, a chair, a window. And they're a little more lax now. When I was there, very structured. So when you were in police college, when you're in your room had to be prepared so that any instructor could walk into your room or my room and they couldn't tell the difference. No pictures up on the walls. Even though it had a corkboard wall, couldn't have anything on the corkboard wall unless maybe it was learning notes. You couldn't have any personal effects, so that if so-and-so walks into your room, That person can't tell if this is a female's room, a male's room, Neil's room, Kate's room. Can't, and so your room is very sanitized. Everything is hidden, and that was part of them developing the structure. You were given
Can
two
I can I
blankets, two sheets. Let
can
me
I
do one part.
interject?
So you're given two blankets and two sheets. Your bed has to be folded on 45-degree angles. That is a must, and it gets inspected. So
Yeah, well, I mean, we definitely have a long-standing history where essentially police services operate a little bit on the same principles as their paramilitary organization, and as a result, those high the high attention that is paid to detail, instruction, obedience, highly critical.
Right.
Let me challenge right off the top, then, just for the benefits of having an open dialogue. I think that there are some, perhaps those that don't accept the police culture right out the gate. So we're clear on what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to separate my own views and just try to have a broader conversation. To somebody on the outside, would it be a fair argument to say that that level of de-individualization is the starting points of building conformity? Because you're removing the personality by in the setup you described. Would that be a fair statement?
I, I think the purpose, I don't think it's a fair statement, because I think the purpose of the individualizing the member or the attendee or the student is meant so that when you are in high stress situations, you don't rely on your individualism to come to that, to bring that situation to a positive conclusion. At least that's the
Okay.
hope. And
Okay.
if you allow people to cascade between their personality, somebody else's personality, their own personal feelings and biases, they might make an operational decision that might be incorrect. And it's about trying to reduce the likelihood of making a mistake or a fundamental mistake in how we respond to a given situation. So I feel like there's purpose to it. I will say, how the angle that I folded my bed sheets, I feel was irrelevant to the end goal. And because I understand the purpose of wanting to develop structure with Keith Richards.
Right.
But I feel like they were too hard on the military side. It should have been a little softer on the para side when it comes to paramilitary. But they have substantially settled on that. Realize that it was probably too extreme. You still have to just polish your boots, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But they're not inspecting your bed sheets to look for that 45-degree angle. So I will give them that. But I feel like that was done with purpose. This whole theme of depersonalizing the individual was done with purpose,
Sure.
so that people don't to try and reduce their individual biases in any given situation or response.
Well, I know that bias, inherent bias and implicit bias is something we're going to talk about later. So we'll come back to that one. You know, even on the subject. So as much as I don't want to ping pong between sort of positions, because I'm actually not taking one here. I asked that question. As, you know, is it a fair statement? On the subject of making the bed, you know, it's funny. That's one I have always believed very strongly in. So my 9-year-old has to make his bed every morning before he gets up. And I think I heard it in a motivational speech somewhere. It's the first task of the day, and you accomplish it, and you've got something done before you've even, you know, gotten out of your bedroom. So I'm big on making the bed. I think it actually builds character, and there's something about accomplishing your first task within the first minute that starts your day in the right way. But that's me, and that's my bias. So I don't know about the 45-degree angles. My son doesn't get that, but he definitely has to make the bed. So you know, we're talking about this environment. You're out there. It's highly structured. And there is a lot of research to suggest that those that get hired with police services sort of expect this, and this is not a big culture shock. Tell me a little bit about the demographics at Ontario Police College. We call it OPC, so I'm trying to use the terms here that everyone will understand, but we all fall into that using acronyms too much. So what were the
demographics back then, and I will tell you that there's not a substantial difference between the demographics back then and the demographics today. Demographics back then, you would see somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80% being your male white audience, maybe 78% male white audience. Of that, you would have about somewhere between the area of 15 to 16% female audience attending there or attendees, and your visible minority sector would probably sit around 4%, 3%, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it is a bit of a culture shock, because while we are a paramilitary endeavor, you are still guided by whatever reflects in the masses. The tone or the culture is still reflected on whatever the masses are. So, and if your masses look a specific way and reflect a specific culture, then it drives a specific culture. And that is undeniable. And now people will want to say it doesn't, and that's fine, but we already know that it does. I think that just because it drives you towards a specific culture and maybe makes others feel like they're the out group in that culture, doesn't mean that those who are in the in group have any nefarious intentions. This is not about trying to place blame, nor is this trying to vilify anybody. It's about saying these are the conscious and unconscious experiences that people experience when they go to the Ontario Police College, and it is undeniable, right?
So what was your reaction? You walk in the door, you look around. Was your childhood full of diverse experiences, or was this the first time that you were in a new environment? What was that like for you personally?
So I grew up in Pickering. For those who don't know Pickering right now, today, Pickering would have somewhere around the area of about 37 to 40% visible minority representation. Back then, it probably was sitting somewhere closer to 20% visible minority representation. The Ontario College having only a 3% visible representation, and I feel like some respects, I might even be generous for that 3%, that you go there and you automatically feel like you're part of the out group once you're separated. I will say, while I'm there with the other 15 Durham recruits, there's 16 of us at that time, that was my in group. And so I felt emotionally safe around my people.
Okay.
You're right. And so that was my in group. But very early in the process, in the first week, you're separated. Right. And then you become part of a different in-group, which is whatever your classroom is. They do their best to try and have all the recruits from any given police service separated as part of your learning, I'll call it your emotional learning, so you're not dependent on people that you already know. And so I only had one other person from Durham in my class, and then everybody else was scattered throughout Ontario in that representation. But you automatically start realizing that it's undeniable that you are different, or you sense that you're different. I'm talking from a cultural diversity standpoint. Sure. Everybody's in uniform. So you all have a common goal, which is to survive the Ontario Police College and go back to your respective police services. But the undeniable part is that I can already sense that I'm part of the group, but I'm not part of the group. And I don't know exactly how to articulate that. It's almost one of those things that if you haven't experienced it, it can be tough to articulate that. But I could already have this sense that I wasn't part of this group, but I was part of this group. And but the good news was we all had a common goal, which was to pass the Ontario Police College, or pass OPC. And so that for me was a little bit of a culture shock, because I kind of felt like I was on my own. It was almost like I was on my own while being surrounded.
Right. And I do wonder how much of that those experiences are informed by the fact that you grew up here. So I'm an immigrant to this country. I've been here for 27 years now. And I was an immigrant of the 90s. A lot of South Asian people moved to Canada in the 90s. And some of my experiences were very different, back then. And I can draw a line between the differences in experiences I had in the 90s versus now, in 2021. But I think that probably plays a role. I was somebody that grew up, I'm ethnically from one part of the world. I grew up in the Middle East. I move here at a time when I'm working age, and I'm hearing things about immigrants coming here to steal jobs. And so my lived experience was very different. And I imagine that growing up a naturalized Canadian, it probably helped a little bit when you're describing that sort of,
but nobody prepares you for that experience. Probably the only thing I could have or should have done before I went to Ontario Police College is to have spoken to some Black officers ahead of time.
Mm, mm,
But they didn't reach out to me, and I just wasn't something that I was even considering. So
right.
you live, learn, and you go on with that. So yeah, that was kind of the early experience at Ontario Police College.
All right. So the demographic thing that wasn't forefront in your mind. It was sort
No,
of the existence that was, and you were sort of there for a purpose, and that's what you focused in on. All
correct.
right. So you graduate,
Yeah,
and to for the benefit of everybody listening. So you graduate from Ontario Police College. That's the base level knowledge all new officers expected to have. You probably come back to your local service. There's some local focused training. You do some
yes,
things with your local service, and then you're out with a coach officer for a little bit. Somebody's
yeah.
they're not giving you a gun and a badge and sending you out with
You're
without
on your
experience
own.
on your own. So you're out with the coach officer. Talk to us about those first weeks and months, and
Yeah,
let's I'm going to try and push you here, Keith. Let's talk about how you felt about it, not necessarily what the job entailed. So
right.
you're out in this patrol car, you've graduated, you've made it, but now you're out there. So what's that like, those early weeks and months?
Right. So the recruiter actually asked me, said, Keith, where do you want to work? Give me your top pick. Where do you want to work? Quite honestly, I was just happy that I was employed. I would have worked anywhere. But he asked me, he says, where do you want to work? So I said, how about you give me Pickering? And I only chose Pickering because I thought that would be one less thing. The lay of the road and land and town was one less thing I would have to learn because I already knew Pickering. And then
Right.
he said to me, he goes, great, because you're going to Bowmanville. And I said, where's that? Right. And so for those who don't know Clarington and don't know Durham region, it's the furthest east town for
Right.
us. But it's also a high farming community, although that's changing now. But at the time, 30 years ago, high farming community, high Dutch population, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Van this, Van that, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, a lot of Dykstras and that type of name. And so I go out there. They have to draw me a map. There was no GPS back then. Drew me a
No.
map. I got there, and so now I'm on patrol. I'm experiencing a certain amount of anxiety because I know that I am not close to my home. And when I mean close to my home, I know that I'm in this predominantly white farming community,
Right.
and I know that I am once again part of the out group. Even though I've got my coach officer beside me, he's got my back. He's going to teach me how to be a cop and all this great stuff. I quickly start sensing that when I'm going to calls that are related to rural Clarington, that
Right.
I am part of the out group. And I actually had a couple of complaints, nothing big.
Right.
I can remember the first complaint I received, and it was, long story short, I was running radar, and this dog is right up against the cruiser barking at me. And I'm
Right.
thinking, whose dog is this? Because we have a leash law.
Right.
So finally the dog leaves, and I follow the dog to this house. I go to the
Right.
house, and I admonish her for allowing her dog to just run amok in the town.
Right.
She files a complaint saying that she believes that Constable Richard would be better served in urban policing. I own a dog. I still have
Right.
a dog. I had a dog then. I
Right.
have a dog now. I have
Right.
no fear of dogs. Right.
Right.
My dog back then was a Doberman, which this dog was probably a lab, and
Okay.
so I don't have a fear of dogs. But there's a legal requirement to own one, and but her bias and what caught me was that her feeling, knowing nothing about me, that I would be better served
Right.
working in an urban police
Right.
environment. And that was the first reminder that
Right.
I was part of the out group, even though I was
Right.
technically in charge, if you will,
Sure.
because I was enforcing the law. I
Right.
was reminded that I'm not part of that group.
Right.
And,
And
and
that's a real experience experienced by a lot of officers of color, I think.
yeah,
Early on in various forms of law enforcement. I remember going to calls and having a lot of my colleagues who were white and dealing with ethnic populations. And I remember the slur back then was I was whitewashed. That was the expression because I worked with. So it's interesting. Those community interactions have so much to do with our perceptions,
yeah,
and they have a lot to do with how we also identify with the people we work with. I think that's a fair comment.
Yeah, and it's funny because it goes both ways. This was not an us against them experience for me. It wasn't me being a black person or a black officer and the ominous white community was against me, because I also garnered complaints, or I would say garnered complaints. I caught the ire of I can remember another call where a black family was yelling at me, and it's funny because this is a high stressed call where there was, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 10 cruisers fight on the front lawn, this kind of stuff. I'm one of the last to show up,
Right.
but they're yelling over the white officers to me. I'm at the back of the police crowd, and they are yelling at me, and they're hurling insults, telling me I should just paint myself white.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Even though I'm the last one there, and I have not had an interaction, they can only see me. They haven't spoken to me. And again, it reminded me again that I was alone. Because when I was the black officer, I was definitely alone because it did not reflect the community or the police service that I worked for. Right. When the combatant was black, they were like, "You're not part of us, so I'm not part of that black in group. They consider me an out group person. Right. But I also don't look like the other people in uniform, so I'm part of that." Right. So then you become a person where you're on an island to yourself.
Sure.
And that in itself garners a certain amount of loneliness, even though I'm surrounded by 10 cops.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where you start you sense of being lonely, even though you're not alone. And it was a constant reminder that no matter who I was going to come upon, whether they looked like me or were a polar opposite of me, that the potential for being on your own was always there. And I harbored that for a long time.
Right. Well, that's that leads nicely into the question I was going to ask you. Talk a little bit about the police identity and sort of the interplay between your identity as a police officer and your identity as a member of your community. So I was struck by your first choice when you said I wanted to police where I lived, and I've talked to a lot of police officers that don't like to police where they live for a whole range of reasons. They prefer to be a little removed. So that was an interesting choice, and maybe you'll unpack that for me a little later on. But how do you experience that? You have an identity as a police officer, on or off the job, I imagine, and you are also an active member of your community. So is there some identity tension there?
Yeah, so you end up you try to live between both worlds, because my cultural background would be West Indian or Caribbean. I know all too well that police are not necessarily given the same amount of respect in the Caribbean as they are in North American policing. And so that's ever present on my mind. But at the same time, I'm thinking I'm trying to be that ambassador for the police and the Black community. So when I'm on patrol in this predominantly white community, I'm trying to represent both entities. And then I, inevitably you take off your uniform, you're now heading home or you're on your own time. But you're still responsible as an officer for any type of interaction that may occur even while you're off the job. So you're never technically off the job. And so you're constantly, I find that you're constantly on alert. You're constantly being vigilant about your surroundings. I found myself always, for my entire career, if I ever walked up towards a pane of glass, always looking at the silhouettes behind me. When you're in restaurants, you're always trying to see where the exit points are. You're always trying to have seating where your back is against the wall to see potential threats. And these are all the things when you're off duty, right?
Right.
And sure. It took me a long time, probably, I adopted that because that's what everybody around me did.
Right.
It took me probably the first decade before I started to try to relax on that. And I remember the first interaction was, if I'm going to a restaurant with a bunch of cops, we can't all be facing the same direction. So I would look at them and go, I'll trust you guys have my back, but I'm putting my back to this because I can't have 5 of us all facing the same direction. It looks ridiculous. right?
It's funny, Keith. We have this conversation in all honesty, like
Yeah,
it's the most normal and natural thing in the world. And I'm catching myself listening to you, going, yeah, 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 I get that. But there are people who are listening to this podcast, and there are people that are going to be watching this video that doesn't always make perfect sense to.
yeah,
So let me just put some context there. There is a lot of research that suggests that the state of constant hypervigilance is actually quite trying on the body of a law enforcement officer.
yes,
And over a
yes,
sustained long period of time, that constant elevated state of vigilance actually is it's harmful for your health, right? It
yeah,
leads to burnout. It can lead to a level of stress, and it most importantly makes the entire environment sort of threatening. So you're always on, and that
yes,
constant adrenaline spike is actually not really great for you.
right,
Which is why there's we now know with research that we need to do a better job with balance and things like that. But I think the average person might be listening to this conversation saying, why are you always feeling so threatened? What is it in life that is threatening you so much? Because I don't walk out my door and worry about where the exits are. So what would you say to that?
Well, the first thing that we know as officers in Ontario is that we are all on an accelerated pension. We're all on an accelerated pension. Our pensions max out after 30 years, which is 5 years earlier than our civilian complement, and even in the same organization, because our life expectancy is 5 years shorter on average.
Right.
So I understand that. Obviously, you always want to hope that you live as long and prosper as long as you can. But the reality is, pound for pound, police officer in Ontario, our life expectancy is 5 years shorter than the average other male or female in Ontario. So you already know that there is a certain detrimental effect to the policing environment. But we also know that people are not everybody's a fan of the police. And
Right.
I don't ever know when somebody's in the parking lot following me.
Right.
Safety is paramount. We get drilled in on our personal safety, but it's not just our personal safety. So it's not a selfish endeavor. It's also you're constantly vigilant for the safety of those around you. And it's not one of those things where I put on this cape, or in this case, this uniform, and say, okay, now I'm going to go out and protect the public. I then take the cape off. Now it's about self. No,
Right.
if I'm in the grocery store, I'm
Right.
still looking for threat cues for the safety of those around me, even though I am not working. And when you are willing to say to a perfect stranger, I will put my safety at harm's way for you, and I don't even know your first name, it takes a certain person that wants to or is willing to risk their life for somebody that they don't know. And
Sure.
that feeling or that sentiment doesn't come off when the clock strikes 4 o'clock or 5
Right.
p.m. or 8 in the morning, right? That becomes part of your life, that you are devoted to risking your life for others. Sometimes you're risking your life for people that don't want your help.
Sure.
But you can't turn that on and off as the clock strikes, and then you throw on it becomes part of you. That you're always looking for those risk factors, and so you're always willing to risk yourself for the betterment of those around you, right? And you can't turn that off.
So if and I get where you're coming from. I'm going to come back to that whole identity question. So you talked about some cultural nuances with with your background, and so I want you to picture for yourself, or picture for us anyways, you're sitting with a group of friends and you're in a safe environment. You're not watching the background. These are people you trust, but outside of the policing community, the conversation at hand is generally anti-police. And you have two roles. You are still a member of this group. These are your friends. This is your background, but you are also a police officer. How does one navigate that reality, that spot, when you're sitting in your friend's living room and
Yeah.
these are people you value, but perhaps your new identity is sort of, drawing you into an uncomfortable gray area? How does one deal with that?
The culture that I've developed with my friends is that they're free to have whatever opinion they want. I would say that the vast majority of my friends aren't necessarily anti-police. A lot of their experiences are anecdotal, so they're not necessarily speaking about the entire police fraternity, but usually they're speaking on specific events that have happened to them. I'm always willing to listen. But the experience that blacks experience in Canada versus white experiences when we're talking in a police context are grossly different. And the
Right.
perceptions of police based on your cultural identity can be grossly different as well.
Sure.
And we have to be real about that because a lot of people will deny that exists.
Right. Right.
Usually it's because they haven't experienced it, so they just deny its existence. But the reality is when I'm around my friend group, I allow them to say whatever piece they want to. Sometimes they will
Right.
solicit me for feedback. I will be
Right.
honest and open about that feedback.
Right.
But they are very mindful not to blame me for the experiences of police in general. So I'll
Sure,
give them that.
but wouldn't it be fair to say? I mean, at the end of the day, the uniform does de-individualize us to a certain extent, and so when you have an interaction with the uniform, and I'm using that term sort
Yeah,
of with purpose here, it isn't personal, it is organizational because
yeah,
that is the informed perspective of an interaction with police. So while you might have individual experiences, those are still the community's reaction to the uniform writ large, as
yeah.
opposed to the individual officer. Isn't that fair?
That's fair to say. But I guess the way it's usually framed is they'll say, "I got stopped by the police today,"
Right.
and so they're talking as a whole. I know that it had to be an individual officer because 900 cops didn't stop one person, but they reference it as though I got stopped by the police. I will then turn it back to them and say, "Who stopped you, or why did he or she stop you?"
Right.
So I draw them in to have that individual conversation versus people talking about the police as though we're this one celled, single celled amoeba that just walks around with one purpose and one consciousness. And I always try to correct people when they talk about the police. And they'll
Right.
say, "What do the police think?" And I'll always draw it back to say, "You want to know what I think? You want to know maybe what that officer was thinking? We can have
Right.
those discussions." But my friends are, I would say that they're very respectful to not blame me, even for the indiscretions of others.
Sure.
But I've had to develop that over years.
Sure.
And I wouldn't say that any of my friends are necessarily anti-police, but they are critical of the police.
Sure.
And to be quite honest with you, I'm okay with the criticism. I think
Right.
that if you're a police officer and you don't open yourself to criticism, then you probably should find another line of work. We are a public entity. We are the professionals. We are hired to be the professionals, and we can't function without somebody bestowing a critical eye on the work we do. And I'm okay with that. Right?
Well, that sounds like a great place to take a little break here. So we're going to take a quick stop. Up to this point, we've been talking with Sergeant Keith Richards, recently retired after 31 years of service. We've been unpacking his early years. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those perceptual factors that influence policing. Stay tuned. Stay with us.